This is Dr. Christopher Sernaqué hosting episode 3 of season 7 of the Current Topics in Science podcast. Today, we'll be talking with Dr. Douglas Axe about Stylus, his groundbreaking computer model that puts the power of evolution to the test by simulating how proteins form and function. Enjoy the podcast. Today, we have the honor of hosting Dr. Douglas Axe. Dr. Axe obtained his PhD and his Master of Science in Biochemical Engineering from Caltech. He also obtained a Bachelor of Science with high honors in Chemical Engineering from the University of California, Berkeley. He conducted postdoctoral research and held research scientist positions at the University of Cambridge, the Medical Research Council Center, and the Biologic Institute in the United Kingdom, where he focused on protein structure, enzyme function, and evolutionary biology. He is the Rosa Endowed Chair of Molecular Biology and Professor of Computational Biology at Biola University, where he also serves as co-director of the Stewart Science Honors Program and a member of the AI Lab faculty leadership team. From 2019 to 2023, he held the title of Maxwell Professor of Molecular Biology at Biola. He's also the founding director of the Biologic Institute and the founding editor of Biocomplexity, a peer-reviewed journal focused on the science of biological design. He's known internationally for pioneering research on the functional and structural constraints of the evolution of proteins and protein systems, using both laboratory experiments and computer simulations. His work has been published in leading scientific journals, including the Journal of Molecular Biology, the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science, Biocomplexity, PLOS ONE, and others. Dr. Axe is the creator of Stylus, a computational model that simulates protein evolution using Chinese Han character analogs, enabling empirical testing of evolutionary scenarios. He's also the author of 2 books, Undeniable: How Biology Confirms Our Intuition That Life is Designed, which won the World Magazine Book of the Year and an Illumination Book Award, and also The Price of Panic: How the Tyranny of Experts Turned a Pandemic into a Catastrophe, with Jay Richards and William Briggs as co-authors. He's a senior fellow at Discovery Institute's Center for Science and Culture, a member of the American Society for Biochemistry and Molecular Biology, and the Christian Scientific Society. He continues to mentor students, speak globally, and lead cutting-edge research at the intersection of molecular biology, intelligent design, and faith integration. And now, without further ado, good afternoon, Dr. Axe. How was your day, and how are you doing?
Good afternoon. I'm having a very good day. I was listening to a lot of me there.
You are awesome, Dr. Axe, and thank you very much for coming on Current Topics in Science.
I'm delighted to be here. This will be fun.
And since this is Current Topics in Science, let's take a look at this week's current topics. In a paper you wrote with our mutual friend, Dr. Winston Ewart, you described Stylus as a model world that enables evolutionary experimentation in silico on objects analogous to bacterial genes and proteins. Can you walk us through how Stylus simulates the structure-to-function relationship in proteins using 2D vector drawings based on Chinese characters? Essentially, how does this analogy preserve the biological significance of sequence-to-structure mapping found in real protein systems?
Yeah, so biology has this mapping of sequence to structure and then structure to function. And in biology, it looks like the sequence is DNA sequences in genes, which become translated into amino acid sequences in proteins. If those sequences have the right properties, so here we're talking about biology, not about Stylus. If those sequences have the right properties, they fold into elegant three-dimensional structures that are just right for holding active sites together and doing chemistry, building structural scaffolds. They become parts of motors, like in the famous bacterial flagellum and in other motors. And so structure is important because just as when we make a tool, you need a wrench to be different than a hammer, to be different from a screwdriver, to be different from a table saw, and they all have the structure appropriate for the function that you're going to apply them to. So I sat down, this was some time ago, like 2005, like 20 years ago, 2006 maybe, with a coder from Microsoft and was scratching my head thinking, if I have someone who can code anything, and this guy's a very gifted coder, Brendan Dixon, his name is on the original paper, what would I do? And I thought, let's come up with something that's computationally tractable that has this satisfying sequence to structure to function mapping. And it took a little time of brainstorming to think about what that would be, but I landed on the Chinese written characters as being a real world mapping of structure to function. What that means is when someone writes, let's say someone's handwriting in Chinese, and they're writing a message to someone else who reads Chinese. I don't read, I know some of the characters, but I don't read Chinese. Then what the structures of the forms they're putting on the paper work to the degree that they're legible and they convey the language that they intended to convey. So there is a real functional task that's being solved by writing. And that's solved when we write in alphabetic English, we're solving that same sort of task. What's nice about the Chinese characters is it's not an alphabet. It's a large set of relatively complex forms, and there's a level of meaning that's close to word level meaning associated with each of these characters, and that's not true with A, B, C, D, E. E is a letter, it's not a word. Whereas the Chinese characters are close to word level meaning. Most of them are word level meaning. And there's just some beautiful analogies. Once I had that idea, I explored it, and there were some nice things that fell out of it, including the size of the set of the Chinese characters is thousands. So you'd be considered literate, I think, if you've mastered 3,000 or so Chinese characters. A highly educated person might be closer to 5,000. And there's the total world of these things is like 6,000 characters, which maps in a nice way to the number of folds that are known, high-level folds that are known for the protein world. And that number keeps going up. And I think AlphaFold is making it go up even further as we learn more structures out there. But the nice thing about the Chinese character set is it's a huge set. It reuses structural components. And that's another thing that you see in the protein world. There are domains that, like maybe a DNA binding domain, that would be combined with other domains to make lots of different functional combinations. And you get that sort of combining of domains in the Chinese characters. I fell in love with the analogy after I explored it for a bit. And what we did is we built a model where sequences that are just like DNA gene sequences, they have A, C, G, and T, very long sequences. In biology, those A's, T's, G's, and T's are read in the cells 3 letters at a time. Those are called codons. And each codon is interpreted as specifying one of the 20 amino acids. So what we did with Stylus is to use 20 vectors. Vectors, just think of it as an arrow. It's got a length and a direction. So if you take 3 arrows in the principal compass directions, north, south, east, and west, you've got 12 vectors. And then if you take 2 lengths in the diagonal, northeast, northwest, et cetera, you've got 8 of those, which adds up to 20. So you've got 20 vectors that do a nice job of kind of exploring lengths and directions. And we just invented this algorithm where Stylus reads the DNA letters 3 at a time, just like a cell does. But instead of inserting an amino acid and building a chain, it adds a vector and builds a chain. So you get this vector chain, which can draw anything because you're moving around on like a 2D tablet with vectors. You can draw anything. There's one more addition that makes this complete, and that is a rule that makes the distinction between a pen drawing and a pen moving. Because if you want to, say you want to do an X, you have to do this with a pen, lift the pen, come up here, and then do that. So Stylus has a rule for doing that. It's a very simple rule that Stylus is scanning a window along the codons 3 at a time. And if the directions of the encoded vectors are within 90 degrees, it draws them. If they're not, it waits and moves the window. So by doing this, you can draw any Chinese character by drawing a stroke and then having kind of jagged vectors that don't stay within 90 degrees to move the stylus to the next position and then draw the next stroke. And what I really love about it is prior models didn't have a satisfactory connection to real function. And the problem with that is you can kind of cheat if you're kind of saying, let's make believe that something is functional. They did this with lattice models. Let's say it's functional if it has a open gap in the lattice. Well, it's not really functional. So you're not really going to appreciate the difficulty and the actual constraints that are always present when you're looking at real functions unless you have real function. And legibility is a real function in the Chinese characters in any written language. So what we did is we came up with an algorithm that geometrically looks at the thing that got drawn by the stylus, applying stylus to the gene, and compares that geometry to what we call an archetype, which is the perfect written form of a Chinese character. And it returns a score very quickly between 0 and 1 to quantify the resemblance to the archetype. So that's what it was published in PLOS One back in 2008. We weren't trying to prove something with this. We were just trying to give the world a model that we think should be taken seriously because it has this kind of deep relationship. And then you can take it and go do interesting experiments, which we've done now, and we're doing more of them.
Speaking of that +1 paper, in that same paper you wrote, Stylus enables challenging evolutionary problems to be tackled in a model world having a level of realism that may allow informative comparison with biology. What motivated you to move away from traditional evolutionary models like Avidia or Terraria? And would you argue that Stylus has greater explanatory power than those competing models?
Yeah, well, in that quote, I'm comparing Stylus to the real. So obviously, it's not the real world. It's not the real world of biology. And to the extent possible, we do want to get our information from doing experiments on real proteins. But it's much easier to frame. Certain questions are easy to frame about real biology, but very hard to answer because you have to go in and actually monkey with these proteins and get structures and things like that. Some of these are becoming more easy, and maybe it's possible that AlphaFold will become a tool that can be used to answer questions with caveats, because AlphaFold's it's not doing physics. It's doing deep neural net association between structures, between sequences and structures. So it could lie. It could hallucinate the same way all of these things can hallucinate. So without doubt, the gold standard is actual biology. But it's nice to also have toy models that you can address questions that would be very hard to address, and it may be 50 years before we can, or maybe we can never address them with real world biology. And in Stylus, you have a system that's got a level of complexity to it, huge number of possible genes, every bit as large as the biological genes, huge number of possible structures, a real space that maps structure to function. So sort of as a theoretician, you can say, well, in worlds like this, Stylus is one and biology is another one. How do certain things work and how do they behave? How sparse is function within the whole space of possibilities? How feasible is it to jump from one function to the next? These are very interesting questions that can be very challenging to answer in the world of real genes and real proteins. And they're even challenging in the Stylus world, but we think some of them can be addressed in the Stylus world. And I would never come to a conclusion from a Stylus experiment and say, therefore, this must be true of biology. I would always do careful reasoning and say, this is what we've shown with Stylus. These aspects of it logically marry up to biology, but we would have to do experiments to show that the same thing works in biology.
Dr. Axe, along those same lines, in that same paper you wrote, in both biology and language, the jump from elementary function to useful function brings with it a new level of complexity. Words are elementary semantic units, in that meanings are attached to symbols starting at the word level. But language only becomes useful for communication when word-level meanings are combined to convey more complex meanings. Similarly, although proteins and protein complexities perform low-level functions of biological relevance, organismal capabilities, from survival-enhancing phenotypes all the way up to survival itself, require the coordinated combination of many such factors, Ultimately, whole proteomes are coordinated this way. So this is going to be a two-pronged question. One, in your view, does the coordination of elementary biological functions into higher order organismal capabilities pose a fundamental challenge to the idea that unguided evolutionary processes can account for this complexity? And two, how does your Stylus experiments help clarify, say, the limits of bottom-up mutation-driven innovation in building such a coordinated system?
It does, but you can strip it all the way down to the individual units and pose a challenge. And I've done that both with real genes and real proteins and with Stylus, the Stylus model. And the reason you can look at if we looked at individual genes in biology, so I have a paper that came out in Journal of Molecular Biology in 2004, where I was looking at the information content in an individual gene, or actually a section of a gene, because it was the part of the gene that codes for one domain of an enzyme called beta-lactamase, and found that it's extraordinarily rare. The sequence specificity is extreme, such that if you were to wildly search randomly through sequence space, it's very, very extraordinarily improbable that you would land on something that works. But if the result had been otherwise, if it were like 1 in a million that you get something that works for a single protein, then that's rare, but it's not too rare for, if you've got 1 billion or 100 billion or trillion bacteria out there, you're going to solve 1 in a million problems. But if you have something that requires 11 1 in a million problems to be solved, now you're in a space where it's beyond the ability of even the entire population of bacteria on planet Earth to have solved. So yes, you get this compounding of the problem. It's not, if I say 11 things that are 1 in a million, that's not 10 to the 6 times 11. That's 10 to the 6 raised to the 11th. So it's 10 to the 66th, which is more like the number that I did get in the JMB paper. It was 10 to the 74th. So it's that scary for a single protein. But yes, you combine them and it gets worse, because you're now compounding them. You're multiplying the exponent, which it becomes ridiculous. For example, the sort of information or the improbability of getting a suite of genes that would be a typical metabolic pathway for making something like an amino acid. It might require 6 genes. Some of them require more than that. You'd be looking at something like 10 to the 70th, 1 in 10 to the 70th, raised to the 6th. So there you're looking at 1 in 10 to the hundreds, less than 1 in a Google. And that just can't happen, because there haven't been that many organisms alive on the planet in the entire history of life. And an upper bound estimate of that is about 10 to the 40th. So once you start talking about probabilities that are lower than about 1 in 10 to the 40th, you're talking about impossibilities in the history of life. As I'm recalling from that quote that you read, the portion you read from the PLOS One paper, is each character is roughly word level semantic meaning, but sentences would be a string of these characters, paragraphs would be several strings of these characters, text would be, many, many strings of these characters organized. And that's completely analogous to how we write in English with an alphabet. Each word has word level meaning. We have to string together lots of words, order 10 for a sentence. We put together five or six sentences for a paragraph, et cetera, et cetera. So in the Stylus world, and I think I referred to this in that paper, you have the same sort of layering in language that you see in biology, because in biology, a single gene typically encodes a single protein chain. An enzyme function often requires more than one protein chain, but sometimes it's 2 copies of the same protein. Sometimes it's multiple genes and multiple different proteins that come together and bind together and become an active enzyme. But think of an enzyme as one step in a conveyor belt fabrication factory. Each step to make the final thing that comes off the end is important, but it's incomplete. You need all of these steps, and it's of no advantage. If I have a factory that can do one step of making my final widget that I want to sell, I can't sell my widgets because it needs the whole thing to be put together. So in this respect, Stylus allows exploration of the full kind of level of complexity that you see in biology. I say the full level. It's got multiple levels of a hierarchy that all have relevance to biology. Biology is always going to be more complicated than the Stylus model.
So, Dr. Axe, in a paper you wrote with Dr. Ann Gager, you said, nevertheless, we consistently see that selection acting upon fortuitous functions of these kinds fails to produce the special structures, the designs, that would be needed to perform these functions well. The products of evolutionary optimization are proficient designs only if the necessary design elements were already present when selection was put into operation. This would seem to suggest that the natural selection isn't an inventor, but more of a refiner. It can sort of optimize existing designs, but can't generate the key design features from scratch. Based on your laboratory and Stylus simulations, would you say this fundamentally limits Darwinian explanations for the origin of biological innovations? And if so, then what kind of mechanism or process do you believe is necessary to account for the emergence of these special structures?
It does place a severe limit. So I think this is coming from a paper where we applied natural selection, repeated rounds of natural selection in the lab with two different starting points, but we also did this with Stylus with two different starting points. And in the lab, I had sort of discovered by accident when I was working with beta lactamase, a variant of the beta lactamase gene that had a large deletion. And if you look at if I put the structure of the beta lactamase on my computer and rotate it around and look at what got deleted, I could be sure that when this gene gets expressed, it's producing something that can't possibly fold into the beta lactamase because a big chunk is missing and it's critical structure that was missing. But by doing selection experiments with low level of penicillin, beta lactamase is the enzyme that hydrolyzes penicillin, so it allows bacteria to grow in the presence of penicillin. By using a very low level of penicillin, I on accident happened upon this variant that has a massive deletion in the gene that still does somehow allow the possessor, the bacteria that possess this gene, to survive on a very low level of penicillin that would kill bacteria that don't have anything, that don't have any hope. And if you ratchet up the penicillin just a little bit, then it kills these as well. But it was a very curious thing. I sequenced the gene. I found this deletion. I thought, what is going on here? This can't be acting as a beta lactamase. I proved that it's not acting as a beta lactamase because there were a couple of critical amino acid residues that are known to be critical to the function of beta lactamase that were still there, that weren't they weren't in the part that was deleted. And if I change those in a normal wild type beta lactamase, you get no function. It would go from fully functional to no function because I've changed a critical part of the tool. Okay, in this one, if I make that change, it has no effect whatsoever. It's so whatever this weak function, however it was being carried out, it didn't involve the normal function of a beta lactamase. And my suspicion was this thing's not folded. It's probably presenting charges. It might get exported to the periplasm, the outer space, because it has a leader peptide on it. And that's where penicillin enters and kills the bacterium. And there might be just something where there's simple acid-base catalysis that's reducing the penicillin a little bit in the periplasm that doesn't require this very, very efficient machine that's the wild-type beta lactamase. And that I discovered, and that's all reported in the 2004 paper. What I did with Ann Gager is we took that thing. It's not an enzyme. It's a broken gene that happens to do something. And we thought, well, you can select that on penicillin plates. We can select that function and we could mutate this and go through rounds of mutation and selection. And if Darwinian evolution if all it needs is function, and then you can make anything happen with selection, then this should become a good beta lactamase type of enzyme. It should become very proficient at destroying penicillin. But we went through round after round after round of mutation and selection, and it didn't improve at all. The problem is, if it isn't a folded enzyme and it's just sort of charges, like say negative charges are acting, because you can destroy penicillin with lemon juice or vinegar. It's not very efficient. It's not nearly as efficient as a beta lactamase, but there's simple catalysis that can happen that doesn't need, in this case, that doesn't need an enzyme. My hypothesis is that's what this peptide chain was doing, not folding into an elegant structure that does something efficiently. It's just acting like vinegar. And for that reason, when you mutate it, okay, it's either vinegar or it's not, you're not changing the vinegar by mutating it because it's not doing anything else. On the other hand, I had also produced in the 2004 study a version of the beta lactamase that had lots of mutations, at 20 something as I recall. I haven't looked at the paper for a while. And it greatly reduced its ability to hydrolyze penicillin, but you could prove that it is still working as a beta lactamase because if you go to these critical sites, active site residues, and change an amino acid there, it has no function whatsoever. So it is the machine. It's just a very suboptimal machine because I put in all these mutations. So think of it as a machine that does something, but I've loosened the bolts and kind of jockeyed things around, and now it's not working very well because things are rubbing, but it's a machine, and if you jiggle it and get things right and tighten the bolts, it'll work beautifully. And that's what happened when we did mutations and selection on this one. On this one, we ended up actually with a super beta lactamase that's more potent than the one we started with. So what's the bottom line? You can do mutation and selection and you start with function in both cases, and the level of function was similar in the two cases, the original level of function. In the one case, it doesn't go anywhere. That's the case where you don't have an elegant, purpose-built structure at all. In the other case, it zooms, it takes off, and that's where you do have this clever structure. It just needs some WD-40 and some bolts to be tightened and a belt to be jiggered, and then it just takes off. Yeah. So that's an important finding because it shows that it's not good enough to show that there's something that has a detectable function. In general, you need the sort of structure that will become very proficient at that function. And you won't get that structure just because you have something that ekes by and does something accidentally. I should also say that most of the functions in life are not as easy. I said that vinegar can hydrolyze or promote the hydrolysis of penicillin. Most biological functions can't be done by vinegar. I should just put that on the table right there. It's only a few of them. And hydrolysis is basically breaking something apart. And vinegar does a decent job of breaking some things apart. Inside the cell, you don't want to pour vinegar because that will harm the cell. So you want an enzyme, and the enzyme is much more efficient than vinegar. But I don't want people to be confused. Most biological functions cannot be done at all by vinegar, and you need these very complex machines. But the ones that can be done by something like vinegar, you can sometimes find something that works at a very low level, but it's because it doesn't have the structure of an enzyme, it can't be optimized, and selection is useless for that.
Dr. Axe, before we close out this interview, I wanted to ask you some personal questions. For one thing, you've had an intensive academic journey, from earning your chemical engineering degree at Berkeley to completing a PhD in biochemical engineering at Caltech, and then continuing with postdoctoral work at the University of Cambridge. I'm curious about the personal side of that journey. During your student years, how did you manage the academic rigor, especially in fields as demanding as molecular biology and biochemical engineering? Were there particular study strategies or learning methods that helped you retain complex material or prepare for high-stakes moments like research presentations, theses defenses, or experimental design?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think one of the things that helped me being at a school like UC Berkeley is I was a commuter. Because I can imagine if I had been living on campus, there's a whole lot of distraction at a big Division I, NC2A Division I. You got all the stuff of parties and fraternities and sororities, and this stuff can be fun if you've got the right worldview to enjoy things and not get pulled off course by it. But I was helped by the fact that I could go in for a football game and then go home and have peace and quiet. And I think that's one of the things that really helped me in my undergrad years is I'm a thinker that really wants a quiet room. And I don't, some people like put on their headphones or play music while they're doing thought work. And I love silence when I'm doing thought work. So I think that would be one strategy is get your, if you have to be on campus, get your noise canceling headphones and just get some peace and quiet to do thought work. I also just kind of by nature took learning very seriously. I was the sort of student who more than once challenged the professor because I thought they said something that wasn't right, and I'd like put together my case. And or if I got something marked wrong on an assignment, didn't even have to be an exam, and I thought, no, I was right. You're wrong. I would go and duke it out with the professor or with the TA. Not everybody's cut of that fabric, and that did have its downside at times. But I naturally kind of took stuff very seriously. So I did really, really well as an undergrad, which opened the door to going to grad school. But I think the work habits and the work ethic help to succeed in undergrad studies or in grad studies. It becomes a different thing in graduate school if you're doing experimental work, which I was. Some of the STEM theses would be just theoretical. So you'd be in the library, you'd be in a quiet room and do your theoretical work working on a computer. But I had to work with E. coli and fermenters and do NMR and lab work. And that required a dedication that would sometimes have me literally up all night, or I'd be setting something up, I'd get it set up at 1 a.m. and then I'd have to be back at 7 a.m. or 6 a.m. to take that over to the magnet and do NMR. And that's just particularly when you're young and you have all the energy, you just have to ride it. You have to ride it. I got married during my doctoral work. So while I was at Caltech, I met my wife and we got married when I had like 3 years to go on my thesis work. So that brings new challenges because now I can't be married to the lab because I'm married to my wife, and I had to do that kind of balance. But she was very gracious and very understanding. So she lived through a couple of years of, particularly when it came to writing a thesis. Now you're not in the lab, but you're like on the computer all the time and running through versions and trying to write papers, and it was crazy at times. And at the most crazy of times, I felt very, very blessed to have this companion next to me because there's times when if you work, you can overwork yourself and you're just on the verge of burnout. And I just need to leave it and go to my wife and just really, really be refreshed by that relationship. So that's my other piece of advice. Get married when you're in grad school.
Dr. Axe, that was an awesome answer. And we have now come to our final question. In an interview called Why Altruism Doesn't Fit in Darwinism, you said, "What the Lord really called me to in my scientific work is a critique of Darwinism and materialism. These corrosive ideas that are really replacement for the scriptural idea that God created and that we are the product of his creation." So Dr. Axe, while not all ID or intelligent design advocates believe in God or believe in the Bible, you do. And so can you tell us why you love the God of the Bible and how he has guided you?
Yeah, so for me, this started, I was raised up into my teen years, not in a Christian home. We did not go to church. I knew I probably would have called myself a Christian, but I didn't read the Bible. If I prayed, it would have been sort of these perfunctory things because I believed in God, but I just didn't know. I didn't so much care and didn't know that much about. I certainly didn't know the gospel. My mom, however, who was not a believer, she was a seeker and she was a faithful prayer warrior even before she knew the Lord. And so she was praying for her family. So her angle was, I have 4 kids. They're entering their teen years. I feel like something's missing. And she just prayed to the Lord. And the Lord answered that prayer in kind of just a beautiful set of circumstances. The Lord brought someone across her path who shared. My mom got connected with something called Bible Study Fellowship and started studying with other women the word of God and hearing the gospel. She witnessed to my dad, and the two of them, I heard a beautiful story from my dad after my mother passed away, that the two of them had the Bible open at night, and the kids were all in bed, and they realized we're seeing the truth here for the first time. And the two of them went and prayed together. Within a space of 3 or 4 months, a whole family of six was saved, and we were all baptized. So I was 14 in high school. It wasn't that long after that that I set foot on campus at UC Berkeley, now as a believer, a young believer who's still learning about scripture. But really setting foot on campus at Berkeley is where I was kind of set my foot into something that exemplified another worldview. This secular, materialist, or humanist worldview is all rampant at a big university. And so it made me have to think, how do you walk as a Christian in a place where Christianity is not being upheld, and to an extent it might be suppressed? And there was an occasion where in a chemistry lecture on the second law of thermodynamics, the professor was like beating on people for trying to make arguments for the existence of God from the second law. And he was very uncharitable. And I felt like this sort of oppression there. I didn't find his argument to be compelling, but I think that's really kind of a point where I started praying about apologetics, because I thought this is an abuse of authority when a professor who's being paid to teach chemistry is bashing faith. And I don't think his bashing had anything of serious intellectual content, but I think it would be really good for things like this to be answered, and answered well. And so I started praying along those lines, not necessarily thinking that the Lord would call me to it. It was just something that was on my heart in that way. But he did start to call me to it. And that started to become clear at the end of my undergraduate studies. Again, I was the sort of student who I saw this philosophical contradiction in the materialist physicalist worldview, where how can you can't have free will. So I thought you cannot understand us as conscious agents with free will if this is a material world. And I thought quantum mechanics does not solve that problem. And I was learning quantum mechanics in physical chemistry. I actually I booked some office hours with the professor, not with the TA. So he's a professor at UC Berkeley in physical chemistry. And I marched in there and I was asking philosophical questions about determinism and free will. And I asked him because at that age, however old I was, 19 or 20, I felt like a professor at a place like UC Berkeley is omniscient. I mean, they know everything. And it became clear to me when I was pressing him on these questions, he didn't have a clue. He was like, I thought you were going to ask me about the problem set. He didn't have a clue, but he didn't say, you know what, I don't have a clue. He was like kind of bluffing his way through it. And I walked out of there and thought, maybe students at a place like this are overestimating the extent of the knowledge of the professors. I didn't disrespect him, but I thought clearly this isn't something he's thought of before. And I'm thinking about this more than he's thinking about it. I'm 19 and he was, 60. But so that got me praying about, okay, what would it look like to do apologetics? And I started to become really attracted to the idea of examining Darwinism. And that took me in the direction of biology and molecular biology. And if you think you're called to something and you test the Lord with it, you can test the Lord and say, okay, if you're calling me to this, then I'm going to apply to grad school. And if you want me to do this, then I need to get into a grad program. And you will, if he is calling you to it. And if you don't get into it, then maybe he's calling you to something else. But time and time again, doors were opened. Little fleece prayers like that were answered. It came to a crunch time when I was removed from my position because of the controversy. I was at the Medical Research Council Center in Cambridge in 2002, and I could tell that the head of the center was getting really jittery because of intelligent design, and I lost my job. And I was removed not because I did anything wrong, but because he got nervous. And that's a time when at this point we had twin daughters. They were 2 years old. And so you really learn how to pray in a situation like that. And I was on my face, literally on my face, crying and bringing this to the Lord. And what I said to him was, I know you called me to this work, and I can't go forward unless you do something. So will you do something? And I don't know what that looks like. And he did. He opened a way for me to complete the work that I needed to complete at another lab. That was the Biologic Institute, Abraham with a B in front of it. And I got that really spectacularly important paper, the 2004 JMB paper, came out of that work and out of that answer to prayer. So it's been a long journey. It's had its hard parts for sure. But when I look back, and when my wife and I look back on the things that were the hardest, we also see the most blessing, I think, in those times. Because I think the Lord blesses us most richly when we're most acutely aware of our complete dependence on Him. And when things are going well, we slip into this mode of thinking, hey, I'm okay and I can do this. And it's never true, but there are times when we realize how false it is.
Dr. Axe, thank you very much for your time. It was an absolute joy. And to our listeners, thank you very much for learning with us on current topics in science, where scientific discoveries are examined in light of origins. You can find Dr. Axe's biographical information, his website, his books, his peer-reviewed articles, and a link to the Christ Jesus Ministries merch store in the description. Please share and subscribe to the Current Topics in Science podcast. It's available on Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, iHeartRadio, Spreaker, Spotify, and YouTube Music. Thanks again for listening, and remember, the truth saves.